Hello and welcome to the Vaults of Terra. My name is Ed and today we're going to be continuing with our Primarch videos with a quick look at Horus. Now Horus is of course the one who the Horus Heresy series is named after, and so was one of the main characters within this uprising. Now, he was known as Horus Lupercal amongst his legion, the 16th Legion of Space Marines known first as the Lunar Wolves, then the Sons of Horus, and finally the Black Legion after the Heresy. He was the most influential of the Primarchs, and he went from the Emperor's greatest son to his worst enemy, in an event that forever scarred humanity, known, as I've said, as the Horus Heresy. When Horus was snatched from the Emperor's laboratory, his pod landed on Chthoniya, a world close to the Sol System and Terra. The planet was populated by techno-barbarians, similar to pre-Imperial Earth. He spent some time among the barbarians in their ruined hive cities, learning to fight and to lead. However, his proximity to Terra meant that it was only a few short years after the launch of the Great Crusade that the Emperor found his first son. This meant that Horus spent much of his formative youth by the Emperor's side compared to his brothers scattered far among the stars. Some accounts say that Horus returned to Terra rather than remaining by the Emperor's side, but these seem to have been overwritten by the more recent stories. Horus's early discovery meant he grew from a virtual child state into that of an adult at the Emperor's side, and for 30 years he was the Emperor's sole son. The Emperor trusted Horus the most of all his aides besides Malcador the Sigillite, and often gave the growing Primarch command over invasions. They also fought side by side, the Emperor saving Horus's life at the Siege of Relius, fighting back to back, whilst Horus severed the arm of an orc attempting to choke the Emperor to death on the world of Goro. As the Great Crusade progressed, time and again Horus proved himself a tactical genius. He was a master of efficiency, using exactly the right force in the right location to crush enemy resistance as quickly as possible. He was merciless against his father's enemies, but spared the innocent of bloodshed where he could, and used diplomacy as much as force to see a secure Imperium built rather than a bloody one. The Emperor left for a brief period to round up Horus's brothers after spending some time commanding the Crusade, leaving Horus in command of the Legio Astartes, which helped lay the groundwork for his further duties after the Emperor had returned. Now, his greatest of victories came at the Emperor's side, fighting in the Ullanor Crusade, destroying a vast Orcish empire alongside many of his brothers and their legions. With their victory over the Orcs, the Emperor rewarded Horus with the title of War Master and appointed him the commander of all the Imperial forces in the Great Crusade. Now, for some of his brothers, such as Angron, Perturabo and Conrad Kurz, this was either baffling or angering, believing they should be in command, or that they should not have to take orders from their brother rather than their father. Others, such as Lehman Russ and Lionel Johnson, accepted the appointment but did not agree with it. Some other brothers accepted the appointment as their duty as sons of the Emperor, namely Robert Guilliman, Jagatai Khan and Ferrus Manus. The most supportive were Fulgrim, Mortarion, Sanguinius, Lorgar and Rorgal Dawn, all of whom approved of the appointment and even bowed their heads to Horus at the announcement, acknowledging the title and Horus's new power. Of all the Primarchs, Horus was the closest with these five. As the Crusade wore on, Horus encouraged his brothers to compete against one another in combat, although not fighting directly, mainly so they could show him their strengths and who could be used best in difficult situations. Alongside this, he led his own legion on numerous campaigns and earned many laurels as the new leader of the Great Crusade. It was in the later days of the Crusade, after contact with a civilization known as the Interrex, that Horus renamed his legion from the Lunar Wolves to the Sons of Horus, a right granted by the Emperor for his great service. Despite all of this, Horus still had many reservations, most buried so deeply he didn't even know he had them. These concerned the newly formed Council of Terra, who for the first time were civilians who had control over the legions, and that the Emperor was so secretive about why he had left the Crusade. He also had some concerns over his suitability for the position of War Master, believing his closest brother Sanguinius may have been better suited to the role. During all this, Horus's brother Lorgar of the Word-Bearers Legion had been corrupted by chaos after growing disillusioned with the Emperor and the Imperium. He planned to corrupt Horus and turn him against his father, gaining the greatest weapon he could get against the Emperor. He did this slowly by first covertly spreading warrior lodges throughout the legions, creating ceremonies and traditions that went against the Emperor's imperial truth, that there is no magic or gods, and the universe was a rational place where people should act rationally. Then, on the moon of Davin, Lorgar had prepared a trap by corrupting one of Horus's old friends, Yount, who had been left behind to govern this moon, and armed him with the anathema stolen from the Interrex. This weapon let the Nurgle corrupted Temba mortally wound Horus before being driven off by Horus's captains. Now the Mournival, Horus's chief captains, did not know how to cure the dying Primarch, so on the advice of first Captain Erebus from the Wordbearers, took the Primarch to the main world of Davin, to the shamans of the Serpent Lodge, who promised they could heal the Primarch. Unbeknown to the legionaries, these were warp corrupted using chaos magics, and who had sided with Erebus to corrupt the Primarch. Using a chaos ritual, Erebus disguised himself as the deceased Hastur Sejanus, one of Horus's captains who had died recently, and came in a vision to Horus as the Primarch lay dying. There, Erebus showed Horus a horrifying future, where the Emperor ruled as a morbid god and had discarded some of his Primarchs in favour of others. He told Horus that the Chaos Gods were peaceful beings, and that the Emperor was trying to destroy them out of spite and jealousy of their power. He had even used their power to create the Primarchs, showing him a vision of his creation before and whilst the warp stole the Primarchs from the Emperor's laboratory. Whilst scattering the Primarchs had been the plan of chaos, Erebus convinced Horus it was really the Emperor's work, using Horus's insecurities over his position and the Emperor's secrecy to convince the wavering Primarch of the Emperor's wrongfulness and that he needed to be fought to truly save mankind. The plans of chaos were not perfect, however, as during this vision Magnus, Primarch of the Thousand Suns, appeared as a wolf in Horus's vision to try and prevent his corruption. However, it was too late, and this led to the burning of Prospero later on Horus's orders. When he awoke healed on Davin, Horus had become a servant of chaos, convinced the Emperor was a corrupt dictator who had forsaken his sons on a corrupt path to godhood. After a long and secret campaign to acquire more legions at his side, Horus had managed to convince Angron of the World Eaters, Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children, and Mortarion of the Death Guards to join his cause. Eventually, Horus was able to secretly recruit Conrad Curse of the Night Lords, Alfarius Omegon of the Alpha Legion, and Perturabo of the Iron Warriors, with Magnus the Red returning from the warp after the burning of Prospero as one of Horus's allies. He also converted the Fabricator General of the Adeptus Mechanicus, Kelbor Hal, who formed the Dark Mechanicum on Mars, and many of the Imperial army units to join by his side. Now, the first shots of the heresy were on Istvan III. Several legions deployed onto the planet's surface several select loyalist units, who were all Imperial loyalists, who were sent down to suppress a fabricated rebellion. The planet was then virus bombed by Horus's fleet, killing billions of inhabitants and thousands of space marines in moments. The psychic shockwave of this sudden death and betrayal was so strong that it blotted out the light of the Astronomicon in the warp. Horus then took his own forces to Istvan V to await the Imperium's retaliation. 7 legions were sent to Istvan V to return Horus to Terra for trial, but 4 of those 7 legions were Horus's allies. As the legions landed, the massacre began, with Horus's forces facing the surprised and surrounded loyalist legions, who were the Raven Guard, the Iron Hands, and the Salamanders. All these legions lost vast amounts of their forces in this drop-site massacre, and Ferrus Manus of the Iron Hands, once one of Horus's closest allies, was killed. Horus took the skull of Ferrus Manus after the battle as a trophy for his command throne, and in the later days of the heresy spoke to it as if Ferrus was still alive, almost raving about the poor discipline and loyalty that his forces displayed, and the corrupt generals he had to rely upon compared to Ferrus when he was alive. 3 legions escaped the drop site massacre but were rendered close to ineffective by this loss of forces. Later, an attempted imperial assassination awakened blocked memories that the Emperor had claimed power on a planet named Moloch. Hoping to gain the same powers as the Emperor, Horus travelled to Moloch. He entered a gate and spent an indeterminate amount of time inside it before returning with greatly increased power. Whilst on the material plane no time had passed, so much time had passed in the warp for Horus that he had visibly aged. In the warp for an apparent eternity, Horus had conquered thousands of kingdoms and earned millions of demonic followers. Finally, Horus had the power to rival the Emperor, although he had obtained that power through strength rather than guile. Re-entering the war, Horus made new strides towards Terra, even surviving an attack led by the Knights Errant who would one day become the Grey Knights, which was led by one of his former Mourneville captains, Garviel Loken. The attack was driven off, and one of the knights was killed. With the powers of godhood, Horus quickly returned to his youthful appearance before setting his sights on Terra, quickly travelling to the Imperium's heart to end this civil war once and for all. Despite his initial attacks on Terra being successful, the siege of the Emperor's palace was where his forces ground to a halt. Designed by Primarch Dawn and manned by both he and Sanguinius of the Blood Angels along with their legions, the forces of Chaos were stalled against these walls. With word that more legions were coming to lift the siege, Horus decided to use new tactics. He lowered the shields of his battle barge, daring the loyalists to teleport aboard the Vengeful Spirit and fight on his terms. They took the bait. Using warp magic, Horus disrupted the loyalists' transportation to the ship, and they arrived across the ship fighting piecemeal to reach Horus. As such, it was Sanguinius alone, one time the best friend and confidant of Horus, who reached the bridge of the arch-traitor first. Horus and Sanguinius traded words, trying to convince the other to switch sides, and when that failed, they traded blows. Before his corruption, Horus and Sanguinius were considered equals in one-on-one combat, with only Angron being considered their other equal, with Russ and the Lion being close to that level. However, Horus was not the same Primarch, empowered now with almost godly strength, and Sanguinius being battered from long days defending the Imperial Palace from Horus's allies. The Angel was only able to put a chink in the traitor's armour, whilst Horus battered his brother before snapping his neck and throwing him down, defeated and dead. This is how the Emperor found Horus, standing over his brother's body, looking down on the Emperor with contempt as the Angel's last feathers fell from his power claw. The Emperor and Horus immediately engaged in combat, trading blows that would have turned a normal person to ash in an instant. The titanic conflict was felt across the ship and even in the warp, such was the power of the combatants. At a critical juncture of the combat, with the Emperor battered by the traitor whilst Horus still stood empowered by chaos, another member of the Emperor's party arrived on the bridge. They were immediately annihilated by Horus in a cruel display of power. Accounts of who this was are conflicted. Some say that it was a legionary of either the Blood Angels or the Imperial Fists, others say it was a member of the Adeptus Custodes. An Imperial legend was that it was an Imperial army soldier named Orlanius Pius. However, it has been shown in the lore that no such man ever existed, and so was not the one annihilated by Horus during this battle. To be clear, a perpetual or immortal man named Orlanius Persson was transported by other powers to see the moments before the Emperor and Horus fought, but he was not there in the battle and was not the one who was killed by Horus. Seeing his once favoured son cruelly strike down a member of the Emperor's own guard finally convinced the Emperor that his son was gone, and that the being that stood before him was truly a servant of evil powers. Perhaps in one small corner of the Emperor's mind he had still held out hope that the young boy he had raised, his son who had grown into his finest ally, lived on inside this misguided war master. If that hope existed, it died with the Emperor's soldier. And so, gathering his full might, the Emperor unleashed all his power upon his once son. All the rage, the pain, the betrayal, the hatred of chaos came smashing into Horus, although some held that it was the chink in Horus's psychic armour that Sanguinius had made which allowed the Emperor to breach his psychic wards. The blast was so great, it created shockwaves in the warp that banished all the demons on Terra and in the Sol system back to the warp, destroying the weakest utterly for all time. It even pushed back the 4 Chaos Gods, who briefly fled their chosen champion rather than face damage by the blast. Horus was almost blown apart, the damage inflicting mortal wounds upon his empowered form and leaving him dying. For a moment freed of his possessors, Horus was able to see what he had done clearly for the first time, and he wept for all the death and destruction he had caused, for the death of his brothers, and the destruction of the Imperium he had worked so hard to build. He begged his father, who was also mortally wounded by the power of his own and Horus's attacks, to end his life before the powers of chaos came back and possessed him as he died. The Emperor granted his son that final mercy, and ended the War Master's life with his sword. Horus died in sorrow, but for that moment at least, he was sane again. The Emperor and Sanguinius were taken by a shocked Dawn back to Terra, whilst the Chaos forces were pushed back, their leader dead, and their demonic allies banished, whilst the raging Blood Angels' forces cut them to ribbons, driven to the black rage by the death of their Primarch. The sons of Horus recovered Horus's body, his first captain Abaddon raging at Horus's apparent weakness leading to his death. The body was taken to the Eye of Terra and displayed in a temple to be worshipped by Horus's more devout followers, his legion being renamed simply the Black Legion. The body was later taken and cloned by Fabius Bile of the Emperor's Children, although this clone was ultimately killed by Abaddon as a false father and a desecration. And that was the story of how even the greatest powers can be corrupted and turned against those they once loved. That is all I have to say in the video today. Thank you for watching. If there is anything you would like to ask or have any comments on, you can leave it in the comment section below or send me a personal message. For any of those still interested in a role-playing game, it will be broadcast on the 11th of July 2016 at 6:30 British Standard Time, so hopefully you'll be there to see that. Otherwise, thank you for watching today. See you next time on the Vaults of Terra.